Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. I'm Mike Drotis, Bible teacher and preacher, and you are watching Solving the Prophetic Puzzle, where each class we look at a piece of the prophetic end times that we are experiencing right now. Today is lesson 11, and I call it The Covenant with the Many. We'll begin in Daniel chapter 9, where Daniel had a vision from the angel Gabriel. Daniel at this point in time was captive by Nebuchadnezzar. He was pondering the future of the nation of Israel, and Gabriel came and gave him a prophetic vision, which we call Daniel's 70 weeks. Now, Gabriel explained that for 7 weeks plus 62 weeks, the nation of Israel will be released from captivity, and then they will anoint the Messiah, and then the Messiah will be cut off. Now, in this chapter, weeks are actually years, and it does go back to the exact date that when the temple in Jerusalem was being rebuilt after they were released from captivity, until Messiah was crucified, was 69 weeks or 483 years exactly. When Jesus was crucified, the prophetic stopwatch stopped. And then we entered into what is known as the times of the Gentiles. And we still have one more week to account for, and that's what we call Daniel's 70th week. So, when does the 70th week begin? In verse 26 of Daniel chapter 9, we get a clue. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. And there is the last week, or Daniel's 70th week. We are on the cusp of this last week. We are not there yet, but we are moving ever closer and closer and closer. And when this covenant with the many is ratified and confirmed, God will once again then push his stopwatch or his timer down, and the time will begin to tick off. And you can be sure that there will be 1 week left or 7 years left until the Lord of Lords comes back and sets up the millennial kingdom. But we're not there yet. So it all goes back then to the tiny nation of Israel. Israel is the prophetic time clock. Not America, not Europe, not Asia. It's all about Israel. If you want to study prophecy and prophetic timing, look at the nation of Israel. Keep your eye on Israel. Since Israel became a nation, they have been hated and attacked by various nations, and with the intent to destroy and eradicate them, to wipe them off the face of the earth. But it never works. Israel today is thriving. The land is lush and beautiful. What Mark Twain once visited in the late 1800s, he described it as a land barren and full of rocks and rubble. Today, it's not like that anymore. The land and nation is blessed, but they have enemies all around them that would like to see them destroyed. And many have tried to bring some sort of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and Israel and the nations around them. And yet, to this point in time, it really hasn't worked. We've seen peace treaty after peace treaty be offered up by American presidents. In 1993, President Clinton tried. In 2003, President Bush tried. In 2014, President Obama tried. All of these were trying to deal with the Palestinians and Israel. Even Donald Trump tried in 2000, which he called the deal of the century. And if you look at it on paper, it was a great deal for the Palestinians. It gave them land, it gave them a piece of Jerusalem, and it gave them $50 billion in assets, yet they refused to take it. They refused to accept it. They don't want a piece of Israel. They want all of Israel. So you have all these peace treaties dealing with Israel and the Arabs, but something different, or Israel and the Palestinians. But there is another peace agreement that's out there that is totally unconventional. And it's a new treaty. It was started by Donald Trump and Netanyahu, and its goal is to get as many of Arab and Muslim nations around Israel and in the world to have normalized relationships with Israel. In other words, they're not dealing with the Palestinians at this point in time. They're dealing with nations. And to date, we've seen that first Egypt has normalized relations, then Jordan has normalized relations with Israel. Earlier or late last year in 2020, we saw that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, both in one fell swoop, came into normalized relations with Israel. Today, there are the nation of Saudi Arabia, Oman, Sudan, Kuwait, Lebanon, and Syria are already in direct talks with Israel. That's 10 nations. That's a covenant with many. What is this covenant that we are seeing develop? And it's interesting because you don't even really need President or former President Donald Trump in the picture anymore, because this is a covenant between Israel and between nations. And what is the name of this? It's called the Abrahamic Accord. If you have time, you can look up the Abrahamic Accord on YouTube or on the internet, and you will see their symbol, which is two A's with a dove in between, and like it looks like a rainbow or something. It also has a mission statement. Here's their mission statement of the Abraham Accord: to promote interfaith and intercultural dialogue, to advance a culture of peace among the three Abrahamic regions of all humanity. And that's the Abraham Accord. You see, Abraham is special both to the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians. Genesis 17:5, God told Abraham, I will make you a father of many nations. So in Israel, you have, or in Israel and in the Abraham Accord, you have the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians all coming together. The basis of this covenant is for three groups to live and work in peace. They've also discussed that it's time to normalize the Temple Mount. Sometimes we feel that there is great animosity between the citizens of Jerusalem over the mosque and what's going on there. But in reality, Jerusalem has been in many meetings discussing how they can normalize the Temple Mount, how they can actually have a temple, a Jewish temple, on the same mount next to the mosque. You see, you don't need to remove one to have the other. You can have them both, is what they're discussing. And in this meeting, there was a pastor, one of the few Christian pastors that lives in Israel and that has a church in Israel. He was invited to a meeting as they were discussing this normalizing the Temple Mount. And they began to talk about, well, in theory, this sounds good, but do we really have the capital? Do we really have the finances? And someone raised their hand and said, we have right now one donor who is ready to pledge and has pledged $100 million to see the Jewish temple rebuilt on the Temple Mount next to the Dome of the Rock, the mosque. Suddenly, the group looked at this lone Christian pastor and they said, well, what do you think? He said he didn't know what to say exactly because he was caught in between a rock and a hard place, because he knew that what they really wanted to do was fulfill prophecy right before his eyes and our eyes, because this temple that they are going to one day establish will be the very temple that we read about in Revelation chapter 13 and in 2 Thessalonians, whereby the Antichrist will come in. So he said, I'm for anything that's for peace and harmony here in the city, here in the world. I'm for anything that's for pro-Jesus. So here we go. And what about the Jewish people looking for a Messiah? Are they looking for a Messiah? Absolutely. But not the type of Messiah that we as Christians think about. The Jewish people are looking for a ruler, a King David, a political man who will come back in power and who will save them from their enemies. And that leads us back to the book of Daniel, chapter 9. We are literally seeing all of this come to pass. How closer we are? We are within it. The temple could be rebuilt in a few years if they set their mind to it. And once the temple is rebuilt, and once there is a covenant made with the many nations, then we're there. We're in the last of the last days. We're in Daniel's 70th week. But we're not there yet. Verse 26 of Daniel chapter 9. And the end of it will be with a flood. Until the end of war, desolations are determined. Now, verse 27 is where I wanted to get to. Then he shall confirm a covenant with the many for 1 week. So we said earlier that when there comes a person who confirms a covenant with the many, you're saying, well, what about the Abrahamic Accord? Yes, that could be the bones of this covenant, but there will have to come somebody, this prince who is to come in verse 26, the Antichrist, who we will find out, he will confirm the covenant with the many for 1 week. And in the middle of that week, it says, and in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifices and offerings, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. So here we have another clue. Once the covenant with the many is ratified, and don't worry, this will not be done in secret. You will see this being done with great pomp and circumstance, and it will be this charismatic leader, this Messiah, this King David that the Jewish people are waiting for, and he will make the covenant and ratify the covenant with the many nations, and it will be for 7 years. And in the middle of the 7 years, the Bible says that he will go into, that he will bring an end of sacrifices and offerings. And you may be saying, but Brother Mike, it doesn't say anything about the temple. It doesn't say anything about the temple in this verse because Daniel obviously knew that in order to have sacrifices and offerings, you had to have the temple. However, let every word be established out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Let's go to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24. These are the words of Jesus. He says in verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Whoever reads this, let him understand. So Jesus is referring back to Daniel chapter 9 about this abomination that causes desolation. He's telling people that Daniel is talking about this future event. And what is the event? 2 Thessalonians. Here we will really wrap it all up. Because Jesus understood as well that the abomination that causes desolation would be when a man goes into the temple, declares himself as God, and creates an idol that is to be worshipped as God. And that's exactly what Antichrist will do in the last days, thus breaking the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and the second commandment, thou shalt not worship a graven image. That is an abomination that causes desolation. But to make it easy for Gentiles to get, Peter in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, verse 3, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, That's the Antichrist. That's the prince who is to come that we read in Daniel chapter 9. What is he going to do? Who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. There it is. So now we have it nicely, neatly tidied up. In the last days, in the last week, in Daniel's 70th week, we can take these bullet points away. Number 1, there will be a covenant with many nations between Israel and these nations. There will be a man, a David, a King David, a Messiah, a politician ruler that will ratify or confirm this covenant between many nations. Is it the Abrahamic covenant? Possibly. It seems to be the bones of this covenant for sure. He will ratify this covenant between the many nations and Israel for 7 years. During that last 7 years, the temple will be rebuilt. It has to be rebuilt. And on the Temple Mount, probably next to the mosque, just like the Abraham Accord is working towards. There will also be instituted animal sacrifices. For once you have the temple, you can have the altar. Once you have the altar, you can have the high priest, and you can have the Sanhedrin, and you can have the priesthood, and they can begin to worship God the way their forefathers worshiped God through animal sacrifices, and they will be reinstituted. But it says here in verse 27 of Daniel chapter 9, in the middle of the week, in the middle of this last 7 years, the sacrifices will be cut off. And the Antichrist will then decide you no longer need to make these sacrifices. And he will erect an altar or erect an idol of himself. And he will go into this temple and he will proclaim himself as God. And he will expect the Jewish nation to accept him as their Messiah. But back in Matthew chapter 15, when Jesus was talking about the abomination that causes desolation, he warned the Jewish people of that time. He says, when you see this happen, verse 17, let him who is on the housetop not go down or take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. In other words, get out quick, because after the first 3.5 years, occurs, and then in the middle, when Antichrist goes into the temple, he will be rejected by Israel, and then he will begin to persecute the Jewish people. And that will be a time that is referred to in the Bible as the Great Tribulation period. When the Great Tribulation period is over, we will then see the Lord return, and he will establish the millennial kingdom. Wow, there's a lot there that we have to cover. There's a lot more that we can talk about. But today, I just wanted to talk to you about the covenant with the many. And we are seeing it happen right before our eyes under the Abrahamic Accord. When I see all this, I get excited because I know that we are near the last week, Daniel's 70th week, and we are getting nearer and nearer to the rapture, nearer and nearer to the Lord's return, nearer and nearer to all these things that we've been looking forward to. So stay in faith, keep watching. I appreciate all your comments. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. I'm giving this prophetic lesson on YouTube, but I also have short dreams and visions, angelic visitations that I share with time to time on this YouTube channel as well. So if you want to get in on all that, go ahead and hit subscribe. And thanks for watching. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for sharing. God bless you. We will see you soon.